thank Professor Robin Kelly for putting in the work to make this happen. And I just want to speak a little bit to the relevance of this event. So if any of y'all haven't heard, on Tuesday we brought up divestment to our student council and unfortunately didn't pass. But one of the things that was very clear from that night was that the experiences of African refugees in Israel were denied. Several folks make the claim that African refugees' experiences in Israel weren't necessarily something to be talked about and to be validated. And so I feel like this event is at a very, very timely place in this campus. We need to learn about these refugees and as well as incorporate this into our views of divestment. So without further ado, here's Professor Robin Kelly to introduce David.
Okay, so first of all, by the way, you all could come closer because people will be coming at 6:30. Some more people coming. They're riding the same bus. They're all going to show up and sit in those back seats. So if you want to move closer, you can. First of all, I have to say before I talk about David and this event, just like how incredibly proud I am of the students, both in SJP, the allies, people who showed up and who participated in one of the most amazing acts of democracy I've ever seen on this campus. The arguments that you laid out, the struggle, it's just incredible that it didn't pass, and it's proof that the inability of that, the divestment measure to pass has everything to do with the kind of investment that non-UCLA actors played in forcing the issue the other way. Because in the end, what would have happened? 5 companies would have not gotten money from UCLA. So it's really not about that, and that. What it's really about. So just keep up the work. Just keep up the work. So anyway, forgive me also for being professorial for a minute, because I'm going to put in my professor hat, because I want to frame this discussion tonight a little differently. And I want to begin with the basic question: is what is an immigrant? What is an immigrant? And I ask that question because it's not self-evident, right? An immigrant is not a thing, an object, or even a person, right? An immigrant is a historically contingent relational category, okay? Immigrant was initially a state-imposed category, not a self-designation, right? It was a strategy of differentiation that determined the rights and privileges of citizenship, in the US here, largely based on race, legally sanctioned through the early 20th century. It facilitated kind of this labor differentiation. It ensured a vast army of casualized labor. It empowered the state to use its authority and power to remove or incarcerate dangerous, unwanted, or deviant sections of mostly working people through deportation. You notice that in that film, those men and women who were marching were not saying we're immigrants, right? They were saying we're refugees. Refugees is what you acted upon, right? And as refugees seeking asylum, they're human beings seeking their basic human rights, right? The creation of the immigrant was really essential in forming nation states and national identity, for the invention of borders, and the construction of a security regime to define and police those borders. Again, this is all over the globe. For ideologies justifying exclusion, inclusion, and citizenship. And as a consequence of the last two, for potentially criminalizing and excluding for no other reason other than a condition of exclusion, a condition determined by the state. Finally, the immigrant represents and is a product of the ebbs and flows of capital. In other words, the problem of the immigrant is a modern phenomenon. It really is in some ways a 20th century phenomenon. It's invented by the conditions of the 20th century. That is, there have always been outsiders, there's always been migratory flows of people, there's always been people displaced by war, by famine, by conquest, but none of these produce the modern category of the immigrant that require documentation, control, policing apparatuses. So part of the story tonight is a story about policing apparatuses, about the creation of conditions that exclude in a very legal, high-tech way. And I say this because, this is a conversation that is echoed by being in California, but is echoed by the fact that we talk about immigrants and immigration all the time here. We rarely interrogate what that means. And we automatically think of Latinos and borders, and yet there's so much we can learn about the category of immigrant in Israel, Palestine, where indigenous people have been turned into refugees within their own home. Turned into refugees, where cheap, casualized labor arrive from all over the world, some fleeing desperate, poverty-stricken, violent situations, where the law of return enables the state to transform new arrivals, so long as they're Jewish and not Africans, into natives, into citizens, into Israelis, and in doing so, produce a kind of nativism or racism that could prove lethal. Where some 60,000 undocumented workers from war-torn, economically devastated countries, such as Sudan and Eritrea, are denied refugee status, subject to deportation and imprisonment for up to a year without trial, endure horrifying violence from racist mobs. The entire community is accused of committing rape, robbery, and other crimes. And for this reason, it really is an honor and a privilege to introduce David Sheen, who's here this evening. He's an activist, boldly challenging anti-African racism in Israel when that's sort of under the radar, you know. People see it as like a side issue rather than a central issue, not understanding that, you know, dispossession is not separate from racism, right? I first encountered David Sheen online, reading his blog posts about Africans in Israel, and then read about him in Max Blumenthal's extraordinary book, Goliath. He's originally from Toronto, Canada, moved to Israel in 1999, I believe, right? He wrote for Haaretz, authored award-winning blogs on ecological sustainability and social justice, directed a short film, The Red Pill, and the feature film, First Earth. You've seen his powerful videos, so I don't have to talk about that. I just wanted to just let him speak and share this with you. And by the way, I know that he's trying to raise money to make his film. So anything that you have to give, whether you can donate online or give, you should do this, because this work is important on a global scale, and I can't say enough about how important it is for a lot of us. And it connects to every single struggle that we're having right now, right here in this country. So without further ado,
Professor Kelly, thank you so much for facilitating my presentation here on campus. I'm just going to turn off the ringer on my phone so we're not interrupted, and if anyone else wants to do so, you're welcome to. So at this point, I'm going to be speaking and I'm going to be showing slides, about 240 slides. So I'm going to turn down the lights so that you'll be able to see them even better. Down. There we go. Excellent. That's good. Imagine, if you would, the United States of America, but one slightly different from the one we live in today. In this USA, the director of the largest hospital in Philadelphia is appalled that Jews are having babies, and he forbids Jews from entering his hospital except under emergency. And the pastor at the largest church in Palm Beach County organizes preachers from all across the country to issue an edict forbidding Christians from selling or even renting apartments to Jews. Imagine in Philadelphia, a city councilor proposes separate bus lines just for Jews because they smell bad and spread diseases, in his words. Imagine where the president of the city council of Brooklyn kicks Jews out of their apartments in the middle of the winter, and the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, gets the police to round up all the Jews in town and kick them out of the city. And the mayor of Sacramento, California, rounds all the Jews into just one sector of the city. And the mayor of Los Angeles, right here, announces that now that Jews have reached 10% of the population of the city, that the city is at war with them. Department of Homeland Security Chief Jay Johnson laments why can't Jews accept that United States belongs to the white Christians, and he vows to make Jews' lives miserable until they leave the country. An Attorney General puts forth a new policy under which Jews can be arrested and jailed, and they do not have any recourse to the court system to protect themselves from these charges. Even for any charge, even for minor crimes, they can be sent to jail without a court case. Now, clearly this is some dystopic future of the United States that does not exist and hopefully never will. But it's exactly parallel to what is happening in Israel. This is where I've come from, except instead of to Jews, this is happening to Africans in Israel. So it's not in Philadelphia, where the director of the largest hospital there, but in Tel Aviv, the director of the largest hospital lamented that Africans were having babies and forbade them from entering the hospital except in emergencies. And not Palm Beach County, but its sister city of Tzfat, where the chief rabbi organized rabbis around the country to issue an edict forbidding Jews from renting apartments to Africans and Arabs and other non-Jews. And not Philadelphia, but its sister city of Tel Aviv, where the city councilor proposed separate bus lines for Africans because they smell bad and spread diseases. And not in Brooklyn, but its sister city of Bnei Brak, where the mayor kicked Africans out of their homes in the middle of the winter. Not Charlotte, but its sister city of Hadera, where the mayor got the police to round all the Africans up and kick them out of town in the middle of the night. And not Sacramento, but Ashkelon, where the mayor forced Africans to live in only one sector of the city. And not Los Angeles, but its sister city of Eilat, where the mayor put flags and signs all around the city, red flags, warning that now the city was at war with Africans because they constituted 10% of the population. And not the Department of Homeland Security, but its equivalent in Israel, the Interior Minister, who said, why can't these Africans accept that Israel belongs to the white man? And promised to make the Africans make their lives miserable until they leave the country. And not Attorney General Eric Holder, but Attorney General Yehuda Weinstein in Israel, who enacted a policy by which Africans can be arrested merely by being accused of a crime and jailed on the basis of that without access to trial. Now, this actually happened. This isn't philosophical or theoretical. This is a daily occurrence in Israel. And to understand how far back you would have to go in American history to reach an equivalent level of legal status, you would actually have to return to 1850, which is when the Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, by which in any state in the Union, including northern states, all someone had to do was accuse a black man of being, or black woman of being their slave, and the police were required to arrest that person and to take them down to the south, and they had no recourse to a court to defend themselves. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out so you understand, because it's so hard to fathom. Let's say this black man is walking down, or biking down the street rather, and a policeman confronts him and says, "Excuse me, is that your bike?" And say, "Yeah, it's my bike." Say, "Can you prove that?" What do you mean? I mean, how am I supposed to prove that? Well, do you have any receipts that prove that you bought this bike? No, I bought this bike 7 months ago. I'm not carrying the receipt around with me. Well, I'm sorry, then there's no proof that you paid for this bike. So then you must have stolen it. So into the arm truck with you, we're sending you down to jail. And this is the basis by which people can be rounded up off the streets if they're African and not Jewish. Understand, I'm not talking about these Africans. that Israel airlifted to the country in the late 80s and early 90s. I'm not talking about the Africans that serve in the Israeli army, or the Africans that serve in the Israeli Knesset, or the Africans that win beauty pageants. I'm not talking about African Jews. Although it certainly needs to be said that African Jews, or Jewish Africans, or Ethiopian Israelis, as they're often called, do suffer race-based discrimination in Israel. You know, white supremacy is a problem here in the US and there in Israel and all over the world, where people who have less pigment are accorded greater privilege than people who have more pigment. And certainly it's also the case that nativism is a big problem in Israel, just as it is here, where people who immigrated less recently feel they deserve more privileges than people who immigrated more recently. And it's also the case that there's classism, where people who have amassed more stuff believe that they deserve more privileges than people who have amassed less stuff. But on top of all of these layers of oppression, in addition, there's Jewish supremacy, where people who are Jewish, or who are more Jewish, however one would define that, believe they are entitled to more privileges than people who are not Jewish, or people who are less Jewish. So I'll give you an example of how all these systems of oppression intersect in Israel. Here's a text that was published in Haaretz, the newspaper that I reported for. In the corners of the living quarters of the Africans, you will find the filth, card games played for money, residents getting drunk, and prostitution. The Africans bring this way of life with them when they migrate, and it's no wonder that crime in the country is on the upswing. Young women and even young men are again not safe going out on the streets alone after dark. Now, this text could easily have been written last week or last month. That's the level of incitement that you can find in the Israeli press. But it wasn't. It was published in 1949. It wasn't about these Africans who just recently moved to the country. It was published about these Africans, Jews who migrated to Israel from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. So I mean to show by this that racism, pigmentocracy, racism against people of color, Jewish and non-Jewish, has always been a problem. And as well, there has been consistently resentment and discrimination towards successive waves of immigrants to Israel over the decades. But the racism that Jewish people of color have experienced pales in comparison, pun intended, pales in comparison to the racism that non-Jewish people of color experience in Israel. So, who are these people that we're talking about? Obviously, this is us over here in North America. Here, Israel and Palestine and Northeast Africa. We're going to zoom in. And these are the names of the countries in the region. I'm going to wipe most of them out and focus on the main actors in this drama, and we'll zoom in. So, you have, at the beginning of the millennium, you have refugees from Sudan migrating towards Libya, trying to get to Europe. And that was successful for a while until the European nations wanted to limit African immigration, and they cut a deal with Gaddafi, who was in power then, and they said, well, we'll purchase more oil from you if you agree to police your maritime borders to prevent Africans from reaching our shores. And they cut a deal, and at that point, the migration route through Libya was cut off, and that's when there was increased migration of Sudanese refugees to Egypt. And in the years that followed, they continued on to Israel, and furthermore, refugees from Eritrea also following the same migration route. Now, people often ask me, why do these people continue on to Israel? Why didn't they stay in Egypt? Well, in Egypt, they demanded their refugee rights. They weren't getting them. They staged a protest in front of the UN offices in Cairo, and the Egyptian police came in and beat and shot and murdered dozens of men, women, and children protesting for their refugee rights. And at that point, clearly, Sudanese refugees did not feel safe in the country anymore, and that's when, in the beginning of 2006, you see the first migration of African asylum seekers to Israel. And that's when, the following year, you have, when there are only just a few dozen in each town, you have already the mayor of Hadera, as I explained earlier, even just a few dozen were too many as far as he was concerned, and he got the police to just round up all the Africans, stick them on buses, drive them to the next town, and dump them in some public park. And just so you don't think that that kind of action is considered to be extreme or marginal or the exception to the rule, realize that come election time, the mayor of Hadera was embraced by Benjamin Netanyahu, and they campaigned together on the same platform. And with Netanyahu running in the election for prime minister in 2009 and winning the election, he then brought that anti-African policy into the federal government. And the first thing that he does once he becomes prime minister is he appoints as his interior minister, that position that's very critical that determines who enters the country and who doesn't, he appoints Eli Yishai, who is then the leader of the Shas party, the openly Jewish supremacist Shas party, whose spiritual leader declared that non-Jews were created by God in order to serve Jews. That's their function. That's the reason that God created Gentiles, according to their spiritual leader. And they are the donkeys that serve their human masters in his conception. And this conception is what guides the principles of the Shas party. So they are put in charge of immigration to Israel. And first thing they do, once they're in charge, is they dismiss the UN agency that filters through the asylum seeker process, and they instituted their own bureaucracy. And they brought this man, his name is Joel Moss, and he's actually, like myself, a Jewish man from Canada originally. And he, for decades, had worked for the Canadian government, facilitating the Canadians' asylum seeker policy, reviewing people's cases and determining who was deserving of refugee status and who was not. And he, as an Orthodox Jew, he felt connected to Israel. And when he learned that for the first time in its history, there was a large migration of asylum seekers, of non-Jewish asylum seekers, he uprooted his life and moved to Israel so that he could contribute his wealth of experience to setting up this immigration infrastructure. But after he'd had the position for a couple of years, he then went publicly on the record and said, the UN and the US Department of Homeland Security, we trained Israeli officers to the highest international standards. But the system is basically carved out to reject claims. The state is doing just about everything it can to not implement the spirit of the Geneva Convention. Instead of judging claims effectively, it's deterring refugees from coming or staying here. So, the refugees themselves say that we are refugees, as you heard in the video that I played as you were entering. Again, you've probably heard about the ethnic cleansings in Sudan. I probably don't have to tell you too much about them. Eritrea is a bit less known, but it's probably enough to tell you that they're one of the only countries, or perhaps the only country in the world that's actually never held a national election in its entire history. So you have a sense of what the human rights situation is like there. No free press. Just a warning, you may want to look away for a minute, and I'll tell you when to look back because it's some seriously disturbing imagery. On the way to Israel, many of these African asylum seekers are kidnapped by gangs of human traffickers who beat them and torture them and call their relatives on mobile phones so that they can hear the cries as they're being tortured and demand that this torture will continue until you pay this fee, this ransom fee, through these illicit channels. And in addition to the tortures you can probably imagine, the beatings and the rapes and the gang rapes and the electrocutions, these human traffickers have invented a new kind of torture, which they take plastic bags and they melt them. They drip the melted plastic over people's bodies, scarring them. And this has been documented by every news crew from CNN to Al Jazeera. Another claim that I often hear is, why does it all fall on Israel? Why don't the other countries, why don't you focus on them? Why aren't they taking it? And that's a legitimate question, and the legitimate answer is because they are. There's no perfect country, and everyone is trying to balance its own interests with its obligations to the international community. But if you look around the region, many countries have taken in tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and even millions of refugees. These numbers aren't even accurate anymore. They're from last year, but since then, Lebanon has taken on millions more refugees. They now number something like 25% of the population of the whole country. So clearly other countries are pulling their weight. And if you compare Israel to the so-called, advanced industrial economies, the Western nations that it likes to be compared to, here in the US, the United States government accepts 90% of all asylum seekers from Eritrea. Some more, some less. France, still over half of the people who apply receive it. In Israel, the number is 0%. In fact, Israel actually leads the world in the lowest refugee acceptance rate of any nation in the world. These people claim to be refugees, but according to the Israeli government, they're all liars. They say, no, these people have not fled any ethnic cleansings and no political persecutions. They're here to make money. That's their game. Israel has a stronger economy than these sub-Saharan African nations. They've come to make a quick buck and head back home and retire on the wad of cash that they've put aside. And so the Israeli government forms an immigration police force, and they patrol Tel Aviv, and they swoop in and they arrest people trying to get Africans out of the city center. And we're in 2009 now, in our timeline. In 2010, this is when, as I said earlier, you have rabbis, first in Tel Aviv, dozens of rabbis signing on to this religious edict, forbidding Jews from renting apartments to non-Jews in general and to African asylum seekers specifically. And then this idea takes off like wildfire, and then hundreds of chief rabbis across the country sign on to this religious edict. And probably the sickest part of it is when you read the Hebrew, how do they justify such an edict? The Hebrew actually quotes chapter and verse from the Bible, parts that call for ethnic cleansing. So it's on the basis of these calls for ethnic cleansing that these rabbis are forbidding other Jews from renting apartments to non-Jews. And this isn't a free speech issue. I personally have no problem with people making all kinds of comments publicly, even those that I find despicable. But these are public figures. They are paid from my tax dollars, and frankly, they're paid from your tax dollars too. And as you can see, they pull in some hefty salaries. And that's what they're paid, and that's what they do with their salaries, issue these racist edicts. Nothing happened to these rabbis as a consequence. Actually, the following year, their budgets were doubled and tripled. So, 2010 into 2011, you have, like I said, in the southern city of Eilat, red flags put on posts throughout the town, posters advertising the fact that Eilat is putting an end to infiltration. This is the language that the government uses to describe Africans, to criminalize them in the minds of the people. They're not asylum seekers, they're infiltrators. And you have, end of 2010, the beginnings of mass rallies, anti-African rallies, where people will march through the streets of the city in the direction of neighborhoods where there are large concentrations of Africans and scream at people, "Get out of here, get out of the country, you're a murderer, you're..." Videos that I've taken, and you can, at your leisure afterwards, you can pick up a business card. It has my website on it. It's just my name, davidsheen.com, and you can see their anti-African racism. I have recorded dozens of these videos at anti-African rallies. All I did was just press record and then translate the text into English so you could read the subtitles. And it's frightening. I never encountered this kind of hatred that evokes at least 1950s Southern United States, if not earlier. And it's bad enough to hear adults say things like this, but when you have like 5 and 6-year-old kids saying, "Yeah, Daddy, we gotta kick out the N-word," it's positively bone-chilling. And this refrain that keeps coming back, when you ask people naively, "Why do you want all the Africans gone?" many of them say, "Because they don't want Africans marrying our daughter." Here, this text, Bnot Yisrael Am Yisrael, Jewish women for the Jewish people. In other words, get your hands off our women. This is a common refrain. Keep in mind, there's actually no way for Jews and non-Jews to marry each other in Israel. Since the state was founded, the control over civil issues like marriage and adoption and others are totally controlled by religious officials, ultra-Orthodox religious officials in the case of Jews. So they don't permit any marriages. Theoretically, yes, a mixed couple could fly to some other country, get married there, and come back, and then it's already on the books. But it's a very small amount of people who run against this social pressure and have interracial or interreligious relationships. But even this small amount is so offensive to some that they demand that entire populations of people be deported on that basis to prevent what you're going to do with your genitals. And so the government at first refrains from kicking people outright, kicking them out of the country, because it wants to protect, to not look so horrible on the international stage. And so it allows the African asylum seekers who enter the country to remain, but it doesn't provide any services for them on the one hand, and it doesn't permit them to work so that they can provide themselves with services. And so as a result, how are people going to eke out a living? How are you going to eat? So those that manage to find jobs, clearly they're almost always in, blue-collar work, getting paid less than minimum wage, obviously often exploited by their employers since they don't have any protection under the law, and people living tent to room, because with what little wages they make, that's all they can afford, living tent to a room, or often living in bomb shelters, or sleeping in the streets, or in public parks, even in the cold, even in the rain. And then, on top of the top-down racism sponsored by the government and the bottom-up grassroots racism in the streets, then you have civil society joining in, and soup kitchens from Tel Aviv down to Eilat announced that they are no longer serving Africans. So only Jews can receive the benefit. It's the weakest segment of society, and then on top of it all, even, they can't even get a hot bowl of soup at a soup kitchen. So thankfully, a few kind-hearted Israelis started up a separate soup, kind of like a Food Not Bombs, I guess, would be the closest initiative here in North America. And people, obviously they offer the food for everyone, but they operate out of an area in South Tel Aviv that's often frequented by African asylum seekers, so at least people won't go hungry. Now, January 2012, the government passes the anti-infiltration law, and it's on the basis of this law that all of the policies that I described earlier that Africans can be arrested willy-nilly on the flimsiest basis and taken to jail. It all follows from this law. As you can see, it passed very easily. There was a left-wing filibuster, but there was nothing to do. The government was overwhelmingly in favor of it. And I should also point out that this law wasn't actually a new law. It was actually an amendment to an old law from the 1950s that was originally legislated to prevent Palestinians who had fled their homes during the war of 1947-48, to prevent them from returning to their homes and their fields and their families and communities, criminalizing them. So now this old law is brought out of the basement and the wording is amended to now fall upon African asylum seekers as well. Once this happened, I was asked by an African NGO to author a report to the United Nations, cataloging all of this state-sponsored racism. And sure enough, the UN echoed the language of my report and agreed with my findings and demanded that the Israeli government cancel this law and called upon them to criticize, to outwardly rebuke, openly rebuke these top political and religious leaders who were making these racist statements towards Africans. Of course, the government completely ignored the report. And the next month, you have full-scale violent attacks. You have Israelis firebombing the homes of 6 African families, and even firebombing, if you can imagine this, an African kindergarten in a single night. I'm going to come back to this story of the African kindergarten in a minute or so. But of course, the following day, there were some Jewish Israelis who came out into the streets and were incensed and protested and demanded an end to racism and stood in solidarity with the asylum seekers. But for their troubles, they are labeled traitors, race traitors. If it's even possible, the left-wing Israelis, the anti-racist Israelis, are despised even more than people hate the Africans themselves. Extremely marginalized, and they constitute only a mere fraction of the population. And so the following month you have literally every other day either an anti-African rally or a stabbing or a shooting. And then on May 23rd, 2012, you have a full-scale anti-African riot. This woman made a homemade t-shirt or tank top saying, "Death to the Sudanese." And again, Michael Ben-Ari, member of Knesset, riles the people up with a speech, but it wasn't just him. There were several members of the ruling Likud party who went up on stage and incited racism against Africans, including famously Miri Regev, who called the Africans a cancer, to wild applause. And minutes later, people got incensed and they ran through the streets. You had 1,000 people running rampant, attacking any dark-skinned person they came across, stopping buses. "Hey, do you have any Africans in this bus? Get them out here." Smashing any vehicle with an African person in it. This woman, they bashed her over the head with a beer bottle and threw her child to the ground. Any African cafe or restaurant, they smashed it, looted it. And you'd think that after an orgy of violence, like the one I just described, that people would have taken a step back and taken stock of what had happened and how did we get to this point? But just the opposite. If anything, they just barreled ahead and redoubled their efforts. And in the week that followed, you had this strange scene where African people were marching to the UN offices in Tel Aviv, demanding, "Please help us, we need your protection, we're being attacked in the streets. We're humans, not cancer." I'm hard pressed to remember some other time when people actually had to assert that they were in fact human beings and not a cancer. And then you have thinking, don't get it, people, it's not just one person who says this. This is a widely supported statement. In the days that followed the pogrom, you had over half of Israeli Jews responding to a survey saying, "Yes, I agree, Africans are a cancer." and 33% of Jewish Israelis saying, yes, we support this vigilante violence against Africans. So this isn't marginal. I should point out that member of Knesset who called the Africans cancer, she did apologize for her comments in the days that followed. But she didn't apologize to Africans for calling them cancer. She apologized to cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. I wish I was joking. And then in the days, in the week that followed this anti-African race riot, you have leading rabbis from Bnei Brak issuing another religious edict in which they deem that all Israelis who come to the aid of Africans are considered rodef. And without getting into too much detail, you may remember that in 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated by a Jewish Israeli man. And he did so on the basis of this same edict, because some right-wing rabbis issued an edict of rodef on Yitzhak Rabin, saying he is deserving of murder. He's a traitor to the Jewish people. He deserves to be murdered. And so any Jew who takes it upon themselves to murder Yitzhak Rabin is absolved of the crime and bears no blame. On the basis of that, one man went out and did assassinate the prime minister. And now these leading rabbis are saying that all Israelis who help Africans deserve to die as well. This is the climate we're operating under. And in the weeks that followed, you had these 6 ambassadors of African nations pleading with the foreign ministry, can you put an end to this incitement to violence? We can't go out in the street without being accosted. Our wives are afraid to do shopping. Just to walk down the street is like hazardous for us. So even the Africans with the most amount of privilege feel put upon. And then we're now mid-2012, and the government begins its first deportation. You may recall that South Sudan now became a new nation, separated from Sudan, and the Israeli government said, okay, you've got your own country, get out of ours. People were pleading, please don't send us back, we're not ready. I mean, half of the people in South Sudan don't even have access to fresh drinking water. So how are you going to send us back there? Let us stay a few more months. But of course they weren't having it, and they were kicked out. And within only 10 days of the first deportation, you had children who were born in Israel, spoke Hebrew, knew nothing but lives in Israel, dying. Because now in South Sudan they have no access to basic medical facilities that would have been easily treated in Israel, but now they're in South Sudan and they don't. So you had kids dying within 10 days of their return. And remember I told you about that African kindergarten. It was firebombed. By the end of the year, by December, the African man who started up that kindergarten to make a safe space for kids, Israel deported him back to Africa. In the same month, the man who threw the firebombs, the courts let him off without even a jail sentence. Same month, December 2012, up until that point, the border was pretty much open. There's a vast desert that separates Egypt and Israel, and there was no physical barrier to speak of to prevent people from walking across. That's how these 60,000 Africans entered the country. So the government spends billions of shekels to build this high-tech border fence. And by the end of 2012, it's finished. And Netanyahu comes out to inspect the handiwork and announces that now phase 1 has been completed and there will be no more Africans entering the country. And in fact, nearly none have, maybe single digits in the 16 months since then. But no immigration to speak of from Africa. And now that we've put a stop to that, we are now proceeding to phase 2, Netanyahu says, to kick out the Africans that remain in the country. Of course, he didn't, he was wishing his gratitude upon those who built the fence. He didn't really mention the fact that much of that labor was actually done by Africans themselves, sadly. without any other income sources, instruments of their own demise. Also December 2012, a headline across Israeli newspapers. Israeli woman, 80-year-old Israeli woman raped by African man. And of course, this news drives people mad and brings out hundreds of people into the streets to protest. Again, more anti-African protests, and this is a still shot from one of the videos that I took, and it's featured also in that video that Max and I edited. You may recognize it. In any case, people are incensed by this idea that a Jewish woman has been defiled by an African man, and they demand that all Africans are expelled from the country immediately because of reports of one person's crime. Now, what was so ironic about this was exactly 100 years previous. I don't know if you've heard of this incident, but this occurred right here in the United States. There's a man named Leo Frank. He had a factory, and a young girl who worked in his factory was raped and murdered. And he was put on trial. He was the prime suspect and accused of having committed the rape and the murder. I don't know if he did it, and we probably never will, because before the judge could pass sentence, a racist mob broke into the jail, dragged him out, and lynched him because he was Jewish. And because of that incident, people formed the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, so that in the future they would work against incitement to racism, and that people would be judged on the content of their character, not based on their ethnicity. And in the last year was actually 100 years since that Leo Frank episode, since the founding of the ADL. Yet in that centennial year, not once did the ADL issue any statement criticizing the Israeli government as it incited racism against African asylum seekers and started rounding them up and kicking them out of the country. And it's not only Abe Foxman. It's really across the board. There are, besides, and I should speak in their favor, Jewish Voice for Peace, but with the exception of that group, there was no voice in the American Jewish community that issued any kind of criticism of the Israeli government. There was wall-to-wall support. And the irony of it all is that here in this country, these American Jewish groups are making public pronouncements in favor of immigration reform and supporting a movement to be lenient towards undocumented Americans. It serves as in this country, Jewish people are clearly a minority, and so it serves their interest if there's more multicultural society, if there's greater tolerance in the society. But in Israel, Jews are a majority, so they do not require there to be tolerance for them to feel free in Israel. So while the government is inciting racism, there was complete radio silence from these American Jewish groups. Why was that the case? If you look at the numbers, what is there to be afraid of? 55,000 African asylum seekers in the country, that's not even 1% of the population. But even that little number is unacceptable to them. And so now in 2013, you have new national elections. Netanyahu again runs for prime minister, and now he's running on the basis of his anti-African campaign and puts out a campaign poster. We stop the wave of infiltrators from Sinai. Vote for the Likud. And on the basis of that campaign, he was returned to office, won another election. And don't think, though, that it was reserved only for the national stage, because now this is political currency to be made on the basis of ramping up anti-African racism. So you have it on the local level as well. Imagine if you would, walking down the street and seeing a poster such as this. To keep those Jews far from my daughter, I'm voting for the Christian Identity Party for city council. There's no shortage of racism in this country, but I have a hard time imagining that this would fly anywhere. This is completely fictitious. I made this in Photoshop. But this is very real, and it's literally word for word the exact same poster. This is on the streets of Hadera in Israel. And on the basis of this poster and others, that party got into council. And it wasn't only in Hadera, it wasn't only in small towns, in the periphery, it was also in big cities, even in the liberal bubble of Tel Aviv, so to speak. It's always being talked about as this, island of liberalism. Even in South Tel Aviv, where I lived, I couldn't walk more than 30 yards in any direction without being confronted with this racist poster. And again, I've translated it into English and flipped the script, so you can imagine what this is like, walking down the street in central Tel Aviv and being confronted with this. God hates lust. Christians don't date Jews, they date Christians. Jews go home. So, after now years that I've been documenting this on the streets and interviewing Knesset members, spewing this racism, I just soaking up all this negative energy, and it's draining, frankly. And so I decide, everywhere, when it's Jerusalem, this family was firebombed and graffiti sprayed, get out of the neighborhood, or here in Tel Aviv, kick out the N-word. It's kind of everywhere I look. It's not just in my own backyard, it's really anywhere in the country. Even towns with next to no Africans in them, there's attacks. And so I decide to move down to Dimona, which is a small town in the south of the country, because I'd heard that there was this group of Africans who'd been living there for decades already. I thought, if they were already there for all this time, then surely the Israelis who live there must have gotten used to their presence, and maybe there's less racism there. And so I needed some balance, so I moved down to Dimona. And it's a really interesting story. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it's a group of African Americans from Detroit and Chicago and DC and other places in the States who, starting in the late 60s, moved out to Israel. It's like the civil rights era, and there's a lot of discussion in the African American community about what direction to take that in. And for some people it's the Panthers, and for other people it's the Nation of Islam. And for these people it was embracing a Judaic or Hebrew narrative where they saw themselves in the stories of the Bible and were inspired by them to, I guess, create a back to the land movement, a back to Africa movement, in which they went to northeastern Africa, to Israel, and established a community there. And it's a very interesting story. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but just to say that yes, it's been an amazing year for me on a personal level to be in an atmosphere in which I feel like African culture and Africanisms are celebrated and not vilified. So no regrets about my decision to move down there, but this conception that I had that in Dimona there was going to be less racism, it was far from the truth. Still, now in Dimona I can't walk more than just 2 minutes from my house, there's graffiti, "We hate the N-word." And this has been up the whole year. No one's bothered to remove it. It's in a public building. And it's not only racism, it's the same level of displacement and dispossession. So yes, this group of people, because they had more leverage as American citizens, American citizenship is obviously prized over Sudanese citizenship. So because of that, they were able to cut a deal with the Israeli government. But there's still hundreds of people in the community who have no status, who are essentially as stateless as these refugees. So this is my friend Dalia, born in Israel, speaks fluent Hebrew, partnered with an Israeli. They have a child together, yet she has no status. She can't work legally. She doesn't get any access to medical services, and even their son. What if he gets sick? There's nothing they can do. They can't take him to a hospital or to a doctor. Why? For one reason, she's not Jewish. And I was shocked at this, that even in this day and age, decades after they'd already immigrated, this was the case. So I went into the government archives in Jerusalem, and I pulled out all these files from decades ago, and I found that it had never ended. This wasn't a new policy. It wasn't just because now there's tens of thousands of Africans. Even when this community numbered only 1,500 Africans in the country, it was the same anti-African racism from the government. So just as Miri Regev called the Africans cancer, and you had in 1980 also a member of the Likud party who later went on to be Speaker of the Knesset, Dov Shilansky, saying that all the Africans should be put on a boat and told to sink the boat at sea. And just as a Knesset researcher in 2012 authored an official Knesset report that showed from police statistics that African asylum seekers actually have lower crime rate than native Israelis. And the report was tanked and taken offline, and he was demoted from his job. And same thing happened in the late 70s with a member of Knesset authoring an official report about the African Hebrews that showed from police statistics they had a lower crime rate even than native Israelis. The report was junked, he was kicked out of the party, nothing ever happened. Just as now, when you take polls, you have 61% of Israeli Jews demanding that the Africans are all deported, another 18% demanding that they're all jailed. So you have 80% of the Jewish Israeli population demanding that all Africans be removed from the city centers, from Israeli population centers. And back in the day, same. The large, overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis wanted all the Africans kicked out, even when they only numbered 1,500. Just as today you have the mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans demanding that the government kick them out, back in the day, same. The mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans, then Dimona, demanding that the government kick out all the Africans. Except that now, in 2012, 2013, 14, you don't just have the mayor talking about it, you have him doing something, sending his municipal inspectors to pour bleach in the cooking pots of the African restaurants to destroy any possibility that they can make a living. Last year you have even the US State Department issuing an official report calling Israel's treatment of African refugees a most significant human rights problem. Once again, the Israeli government completely ignored that. Full speed ahead, with the new government, Netanyahu appoints that very woman who called Africans cancer. He appoints her to head the Interior Committee, the very committee that determines the fate of African people. And the government then issues a report, an official report, detailing the plan, its protocols for what to do with Africans. And among the suggestions made in this official report were that Israelis who are in solidarity with them be labeled anti-Semites and potential terrorists, including this Jewish bubby, the bottom right. Clearly, very dangerous character you would not want to meet in any dark alley. Clearly a potential terrorist. And then the government realizes that all bark, no bite, there's no repercussions, no matter what steps it takes, no matter how racist it gets, no one says or does anything. No one's watching. So, until now, it had refrained from outright deporting people back to Africa. Now, it does so freely. And ironically, the first day of the deportations was literally 75 years to the day after the Evian conference. If you haven't heard of the Evian conference, just a little history lesson, on the very eve of the Holocaust, when it was clear that Nazi Germany was determined to dispose of all its Jews, Western nations, including this one, they gathered in Evian, France, to determine maybe if you take in some Jewish refugees, and maybe if we take in some, and maybe if they take in some, we can solve this problem, provide an escape. But they all went home from the conference, and almost all the people eventually went on to perish in the Holocaust because no nation would take them in. So exactly 75 years to the day after their fate was sealed, after these governments refused to accept Jewish refugees because they were Jewish, Israel begins to deport refugees because they're not Jewish. Once that happens, UN representative in Israel calls that act the gravest violation possible of the Refugee Convention that Israel has signed, a crime never before committed. Now, in Israel, there are some stopgap measures to protect civil rights and human rights, and the last bastion of liberalism, according to some, is the Supreme Court, and they weighed in on this after it took them long enough, but finally they stepped in and they said, this is an egregious violation of human rights. This law is unconstitutional. We're striking this down. You have 3 months to release all African asylum seekers from Israeli jails. It was a hard fight, but it was won in the courts, and it was a unanimous decision. All 9 Supreme Court justices voted to strike down this anti-infiltration law. But immediately, the Attorney General told enforcement to ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court and to continue arresting Africans. And they have. And so the government's plan has proceeded, which is make their lives miserable so they'll agree to self-deport. Round them up off the streets of Tel Aviv, stick them in jail in these desert detention centers where they can be held indefinitely. And eventually, they'll become so depressed, despondent, that they'll agree to accept to go back even to the countries that they fled from. At this point, the community realizes there's nowhere left to turn. If even the Supreme Court is ignored, what's left? What defenses do they have? And so they band together. And I should point out, it's not obvious. These are people from different religions, different backgrounds, different countries, different ethnic groups and nationalities, but they came together and they ironed out their differences, and they held huge rallies. Here it's 25,000 people, and they've really tried every tactic possible. They've been quite creative, going to Tel Aviv City Hall and going to the Knesset in Jerusalem and to the American Embassy and to the Canadian Consulate and to the UN offices and to the African Union, and really they've been teaching Israelis a lesson in democracy. And they've had sit-ins and strike-ins and sleep-ins and all manners of nonviolent protest. But no matter how loud their voices are raised, it doesn't make a dent in government policy. The government responded by saying, we don't care how much you protest or how long you strike for. We're going to continue rounding you up and kicking you out of the country. And that's the situation that we're in right now. By the time I go back to Israel, I don't know if my friends among the African community will still be free or whether they'll already be rounded up into these jails. And what are these jails that people are being rounded up into? Because in the Israeli media, they were advertised as some kind of, 5-star hotel practically, the way it was. They were talking about, they're going to have recreational facilities and they're going to have educational facilities, and you're going to want to be there yourself. This is like how, people to convince people that it was okay. But of course, there are no such facilities. It's in the middle of the desert. There's nothing as far as the eye can see. It's on the border with Egypt, surrounded by sand, surrounded by a shooting range. There's nowhere to go. they're, stuck in these trailers that don't have heating in the winter, food, if you can call it that, no fruit, no vegetables. I don't know if that pink goop is supposed to be something, but I mean, no hot water often. The idea is make it as miserable as possible. Even medical facilities, the basic bare minimum, the government doesn't even provide that. So volunteer organizations like Physicians for Human Rights have to, of their own volition, come out on the weekends and open up clinics on the ground in front of the jails. If you can imagine that even in 2014, the government doesn't see fit to even invest that little minimal amount of money to provide medical services. And probably most insulting of all is this sign at the entrance. Office of Employment. Employment for the society. What an Orwellian term. They couldn't have chosen, especially considering Jewish history, they couldn't have chosen a more insulting term. Okay? I don't need to tell you, if you're a student of history, that at the entrance to Auschwitz they had this sign that said, "Work makes you free." Claiming that this is some kind of work camp and not a concentration camp. And if you're offended by that comparison, you damn well should be. And you should direct your outrage towards the Israeli government, who aren't even embarrassed, and even in their own report, which I outlined a few minutes ago, in their own report, they clearly use that language to describe their policy. Concentration of the Africans. You can open any Hebrew-English dictionary and you will find that the word rikuz means concentration, and machane rikuz is concentration camp. Take it up with them. I didn't say death camp, don't get it twisted. Okay? A concentration camp is where people are forced to be against their will, without having committed any crime, solely because of their political persuasion or their ethnic affiliation. And that is a precise definition of what is happening right now. And don't put it all on Germany. Okay? Throughout history, well before World War II, there were concentration camps, including in this country. Cherokee Indians were rounded into concentration camps in the 1840s. And since World War II, sadly, many other nations have created concentration camps. But yeah, that's what it is. And even the president of Eritrea, this despicable man who is responsible for thousands of people fleeing every month, even he has called these detention centers concentration camps. And he's not the only president to do so. Even Reuven Rivlin, member of Knesset, former speaker of the Knesset, and now leading candidate to be Israel's next president, called these detention centers concentration camps. The level of anti-African and anti-Gentile racism in Israel is so high that it's so. Also, if you speak Hebrew, it's transparent. It's out there. There's no people aren't even ashamed of it. There's no effort to conceal it. So, anytime you have a news report about someone being attacked, some either Arab or Asian or African, here you have Channel 10 reporting, this is just before I came, Israeli man attacks an African man in Tel Aviv for no reason. That's the news report. And here people in their own names, under their own accounts, respond with the most vicious racism you can possibly imagine, no shame around it. And if you think that is bad, okay, as I said, it's almost that even greater ferocity and even greater hate is reserved for those few Israelis who actually come to the aid of the Africans. So that man who started up the soup kitchen that serves African asylum seekers, this is what people post on his Facebook page. And this is symptomatic. There's many comments just like this. I only am just using a couple of examples to make the point. But maybe the worst example that I can think of that sticks out in my mind is this piece of junk mail that Israelis received in late 2012. They opened this envelope, and I've translated it for you again. It says on the front, "The solution to the problem of the infiltrators." The average Israeli receiving an envelope such as this would assume, oh, this is now some kind of proposal for what to do about these African asylum seekers who's entered the country. And when they open up the envelope, they find that within is an advertisement to exterminate vermin. So this isn't a company or a corporation trying to convince Israelis that Africans should be exterminated. It's actually something far more insidious than that. It's a company assuming that Israelis already find nothing wrong with that comparison, assuming that they will find it humorous to make that comparison, and hoping that by getting a chuckle out of them, they will get these people to call them up and hire them for their services. That's how sick it gets. That's how much African people have been dehumanized in the mind of the Israeli population. I don't need to tell you about how in the run-up to World War II, Jewish people were often compared to insects and vermin that need to be exterminated, saying that they're spreading diseases. And this prepared in people's minds the idea that they could be. Of course, once again, it's not all about Germany. In this country as well, you had the US government putting out these propaganda messages associating Japanese people with vermin that needed to be exterminated, again, to incite hatred towards these groups. So America isn't off the hook. But that's the idea, to prepare people for the idea that they are not human and that any action taken by the government is completely acceptable. Why is it that when Max Blumenthal publishes his book, Goliath, about Israel and about the racism in Israel that's rampant, and he has chapter headings which draw parallels between the anti-African racism in Israel and the anti-Jewish racism in Germany of the 30s. Why is it that they are so ferociously condemning him for making the parallels, yet these same so-called intellectuals have absolutely nothing to say about the actual incidences of anti-African violence that are occurring all the time in Israel? Not a peep out of them. And then January 2014, bringing up to the present, an African family is standing in the middle of the street in downtown Tel Aviv. Mother is holding the baby in her arms, and a white Israeli man walks up to her and stabs the baby in the head 3 times. Of course, perpetrator, white, the victim, brown. Obviously, the police, within minutes, oh no, there's no racism involved. This is a lunatic. This is psychotic, this person. And I really resent that this knee-jerk, before they even know any evidence, quickly saying, oh no racism at all. We got no racism in our society. Of course, in the weeks that followed, the stabber's confession was leaked to the media, and then we saw in his own words what he had to say when asked why he stabbed this baby, this 1-year-old baby. I don't mean to suggest for a second that this man is symptomatic of the entire society. Obviously, he is crazy. Obviously, anyone who would stab a 1-year-old baby in the head is psychotic. It goes without saying. But why did he stab a brown baby? Because for months and years, top political and religious officials in Israel have incited anti-African racism. That's why. And no one has said squat about it. how long does this have to go on for? How many more babies? How many more children? It isn't being reported in the American media. There's complete silence. Why do I have to come here to speak to you on campus and inform you about these things for the first time? You should already be knowing about this. I don't want to keep you any longer. I thank you for the time you've given me, and I urge you to tell these stories, because clearly the mainstream media isn't going to do it any justice. I just want to leave you with two thoughts, and that is that, in my mind, the people who want these children gone because they aren't Jewish are, as far as I'm concerned, no better than the people who wanted these children gone because they were Jewish. If there's anything we must take from these horror stories of our history, it's that never again isn't about us only. It's never again for anyone. And this idea that's being propagated, and right now I don't know why Netanyahu followed me to Los Angeles. I can't get away from him there, and I try to come here, and he follows me here everywhere I go. And I'm so angered that he and that Obama and other world leaders have signed on to this demand. He's insisting that the Palestinian leadership and the Arab leaders and the Martian leaders and the Alpha Centauri leaders, who knows how far, he's insisting that the whole universe accept this self-definition that Israel is a Jewish state. And this is what this looks like, okay? When the Israeli government feels entitled, look how it treats non-Jewish people, simply for not being Jewish. And if we sign off on this, if we give Israel a carte blanche, that it will now be considered the Jewish state, and we've already accepted this a priori, imagine what then the government is capable of doing. So it's too bad I wasn't here a week ago. Maybe I could have contributed to the discourse and, somehow stop the disinformation campaign. But it's now on you to take this to the next step. So thank you, and I'm happy to stick around a bit.
I guess my first reaction is, how are Ethiopian Jews in Israel responding to this violence? Has there been a corrective action?
To me, it's been one of the saddest things that I've experienced surrounding this issue. Maybe it shouldn't be so surprising, but it's still saddening. Because of the colonial logic, there's this divide and conquer strategy where, think about it, in the Jewish Israeli society, Ethiopians are the lowest rung. They're the darkest skinned. They immigrated most recently. They have the least amount of resources. So they have the least amount of privileges in society. And so in order to access privilege, their only recourse is to their Jewishness. And so they are often very, of course, it should be said, there are some amazing activists, Ethiopian Israeli activists, who certainly see the problem as affecting them no differently and are demanding an end to the government racism and society's racism. But sadly, they're few and far between, and many Ethiopian Israelis are in lockstep with the government's proposals. And also think, they can often be the victims. I have Ethiopian friends who have been attacked because people assume that they are African asylum seekers, non-Jewish African asylum seekers. So, unfortunately, some of the most hateful comments that I've heard have come from Ethiopian Israelis.
This was great. Thank you so much. Do you see any organization for I mean, what's the response to the 48 Palestinians, the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship? Do you see anything going on there with respect to the African asylum seekers?
It's somewhat similar to the situation because a little bit different, but there are similarities because until recently, a lot of it's by no means across the board, but a lot of the blue-collar labor in Israel is often filled by 48 Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And so that community, more than others, experiences the being pushed or edged out or undercut from the labor market, because if you aren't working legally, you'll work for less than minimum wage, driving wages down. So in some senses, this community has experienced also, it's affecting them negatively as well. And so some people are, outright against. On the other hand, there are communities where Africans have found refuge, like in Rahat. You have many Sudanese people living there and merging in with the society and being accepted and welcomed. So certainly you have activists who are making the connections and saying, just as, everyone should have a right to live here, doesn't matter what their ethnicity is or their religion is, you are welcome here, and the efforts to expel you are part of the same logic of the Jewish state to drive out non-Jewish people. So people are making those connections, but there's no mass movement yet.
Can you comment on the forced sterilization of the African women in Israel? Like, is it still going on?
Okay, so that affected Jewish Africans, the Ethiopian Israelis that I discussed, and since that happened, since that came to light, I should point out that story was reported on well before last year. Jonathan Cook, who's probably the best journalist in the country, reported that years before it came out in the media, in the mass media recently. But once it did break, certainly there have been efforts by the government to phase out. But it doesn't change the fact that it was government policy. And more to the point, why is it that these policies only affected sub-Saharan African Jews? There aren't any other groups of Jews who move to Israel in which the entire population is put in some kind of camp beforehand, where they are educated, where they are told which medicines to take, where they have to go through conversion rituals. As if you saw the video I screened before we came in, many of the Russian Jews who moved to Israel aren't Jewish themselves, or have one Jewish parent or one Jewish grandparent. They aren't considered Jewish by Jewish law, yet none of them were forced to go through immersion rituals or education programs, or their fertility was not inhibited in any way. Why is it that it only happened to the African Jews? It's out and out racism. And I heard that this was denied on campus. The only part of the story that was slightly misreported, the only part, was in an article in Haaretz. It claimed that the government accepted responsibility for it. Actually, it admitted that it happened, but it didn't accept fault. It didn't accept responsibility for it. And it was reported that it did. It actually just acknowledged that it happened. So that's the only error in the story. The actual forced sterilization did occur, and there's no disputing that it occurred. And there's dozens of, unless they're claiming that all these Ethiopian women are lying about it, which you can take it up with them. But that did occur, and it's scandalous that people deny that. There's no question about it.
Is it common to refer to African refugees as terrorists?
It does. In the minds of some people who are just frothing at the mouth racists, you will hear that claim, but it's not. No logical person would claim that, because there hasn't been even one case of any African who has been put on trial or even accused of any terrorist-related incident. So for people who will throw feces and are just hoping that it sticks. They'll use any insult, but there are zero examples of any even accusations of such an action.
Thank you again for coming and speaking with us. I was curious if you have any idea or thoughts about what the fate generally might be for asylum seekers. What would that be, and do you think ultimately it's up to any progressives within Israel, as much of a minority as they might be, to change the trajectory for them, or what would that be?
Okay. So people who advocate for Africans in Israel are just saying, what are they asking for? They're just saying to the government, follow the international agreements that you were a signatory to, and in fact that you co-authored in the shadow of the Holocaust. So if they're just asking the government to openly and transparently examine on a case-by-case basis all of these requests. And what will happen? I have a hard time imagining that there's anything within the society that progressives can do, because they've been trying, but there are so few and they're so marginalized, and the invective against them is so great that I don't see any force in Israeli society that can turn that around. And if you look statistically at the surveys that are published, the scariest part is that it's not getting better, it's getting worse. It's, again, anti-Gentile racism isn't only towards Africans. You know, Palestinians have been the ones who have experienced the most over the years and over the decades. And if you look at statistics, when you ask even the Israeli youth, often the youth are more racist than their parents, and you ask them, would you live in a building, in an apartment building that had an Arab family? Would you study in a classroom that had other students who were Arab? I mean, at least half the students refuse to live in a building or study in a classroom with Arabs. And the worst part is, if you look back 5 years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the trajectory is it's getting more racist. The youth are more racist than ever before. So that's the scariest part, that I don't see any force in society that can turn that around. You know, people have been fighting for Palestinian rights for decades on the outside, and in all this time, Palestinian people have only been more and more dispossessed. So it's also hard to imagine it happening from the outside, but at the same time, you have this burgeoning movement. For some people, adopting BDS, the boycott and divestment sanctions strategy, nonviolent tactic, and call it economic democracy. I believe that people have the right to choose wisely how to invest their money. The fact that the Israeli government seems so fearful of this and is constantly talking about this and demonizing all people who participate as anti-Semites, it tells me that perhaps there is something to it, But I mean, I think that we need to try everything. I won't criticize any nonviolent tactic. As far as I'm concerned, throw everything at the monster, at the beast, until it falls. But critically, people in this country do have a lot of leverage, potentially, because so much American tax money goes to Israel. And, I think all Americans have a role to play here, but I think maybe even more so, African Americans and Jewish Americans have some kind of special leverage here because of the situation. So clearly that's not going to happen unless we have, informational campaigns and people become aware of what's going on. But, what I'm trying to do is at least put all of these, document this stuff and then put it online so anyone can access it and run with it. So you got the videos, you can do with it what you will. You've got these reports, and you can then put it out there for your communities. So it's hard to have hope, but that's why I've come here. That's why I've crossed the continent and wasted all this jet fuel.
Sorry. I have a question about the image that you showed with that border that was constructed in the desert, where Netanyahu went to look at the completion of it. It reminds me of another border that's not too far away from here, that's in the desert. And I know that every day folks die trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. So you mentioned that there was like a decline of immigrants, even crossing it. Do you know more about it, or kind of like the numbers of that?
I can tell you a little bit. In the months that preceded the construction, you had 1,000 people, or you have just a handful, like less than 10. Maybe the whole year, maybe 20 people. Maybe like 1 or 2 people a month manage to get through. What happens is, obviously, there are wild communities of non-human animals who live in the region, and it's their right to not be inhibited and to be able to move across these human-made borders. So in the fence system, every once in a while, they have these holes that only small animals can get through. Maybe a contortionist human being could, and that's how these few humans are able to get through. But there are holes for animals to get through, and that's perhaps how those few are able to cross. But ultimately, and I should point out that the cross-border human trafficking continues. There are people who have always brought in modern slave conditions people into Israel. There's been in recent years it's slowed down, but for years Israel was on the list of human trafficking lists put out by the United States government, because often Eastern European women were being kidnapped and raped and then forced into prostitution and brought into Israel. That has mostly stopped, but the people who did it, who facilitated that human trafficking, still make a business of it. And I know incidences of people who easily crisscross the border and continue human trafficking. So it is possible, people still do it, but the amount of migrants who manage to make it across are extremely few.
You take one more question.
The famous 10-minute video you did for the Nation magazine, I believe it was first commissioned by New York Times, right? And what happened to it? Why did they reject it?
Well, the conversation they had was with Max, but based on the emails that went back and forth that he showed me, they just refused to talk about it, because seemingly having a conversation about it would mean having to admit the real reasons. They solicited it. We did the work. The least they could have done was spoken to us and told us. And we would have been open to, it's not factual. We can't run it because it's not factual, or it's to this or to that, but they didn't want us, they didn't say anything. They didn't have anything to say. In fact, an Oscar-winning documentary editor, filmmaker, saw the video and was like telling the Times, "Yo, you've got to, I'd be happy if this, if you want to tweak it, I'd be happy to get in there and cut it." So I think it stands fine as it is, but the point is that if all they wanted was a few tweaks, or if they had any specific problem, they could have told us. But they couldn't tell us because the real reason was that they were being censored, and they were afraid of the shitstorm that would result if they published this. And that was really sad to me when it happened, to think that this bastion of liberal media, so-called, wasn't even willing to publish it. And sickeningly, the same week that they refused to publish our video, they did publish a video out of Israel that was completely whitewashing. It focused on Jaffa, the historic cultural capital of Palestine, which is now South Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv grew out of it, but it's now a southern suburb of Tel Aviv. And it focused only and exclusively on the Jewish culture of Jaffa, as if it exists with, in no context whatsoever to its Palestinian heritage. So I just resented all the more that they wouldn't run our piece, but they published this fluff piece about Jaffa. So that's just more reason for me to believe that that we're going to be having an uphill struggle to tell these stories. We can't rely on corporate media. We need to use the tools that we have and our networks of activists to spread the word. And I should point out that this is also the case with the so-called last liberal paper in Israel, Haaretz. It's the only newspaper that isn't a tabloid, New York Post-style tabloid. But even there, in recent years, there's a lot of pressure to make it more, less liberal. And I can give all kinds of examples of. I'm not going to go into it right now, but later on we can talk some more, and I can tell you about how in recent years they too, fearful of their bottom line, because ultimately all these newspapers have to make a living. They're capitalist enterprises, and if most of the people demand right-wing news and they don't give them enough of that, they're going to be, they won't have a functioning business model. So all the media in Israel, and clearly in America as well, is going to be somewhat biased towards the right-wing narrative. And so it's incumbent upon us to try to circumvent that and get the word out there.
Well, on that note, just remember we have to continue this conversation. And remember, we actually have an African Studies Center at this university that hasn't done anything on this. So you might want to make the request. So anyway, thanks a lot.